Tonight we're going to resume our study of patriarchal prophecies, or that is prophecies regarding the Messiah that were made during the patriarchal age. When I first began this study, I didn't really realize that there were so many prophecies of Christ that were given before the book of Psalms and the book of the major, and the books, rather, of the major and the minor prophets. Obviously, we knew that Psalms told a lot about the coming of the Christ, and we knew that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, those guys, they all foretold a lot, and all the 12 minor prophets, they foretold a lot. We knew that. But I didn't realize there was so much information given all the way back from the beginning of time forward. But there is. And tonight we're going to resume our study of prophecies given during the patriarchal age. So we've titled this Patriarchal Prophecies Part 2. Let's look at the Shiloh prophecy that we find given at the end of the book of Genesis. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. In Genesis chapter 49, we find Israel here speaking to his sons and speaking a blessing to them about their future. And regarding the tribe of Judah, he said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be." Now, this passage foretells that the kingly scepter would not depart from the tribe of Judah until Shiloh came. And then he refers to the one as having that kingly scepter. He refers to that person as a lawgiver. So there's going to be someone future to this passage who would be both a king and a lawgiver. Now tonight we're going to study about Moses and how he was a lawgiver. But this passage isn't foretelling Moses, because Moses wasn't a king. This individual who's the subject of this passage is both a king and a lawgiver. Now, if we're looking at this in the big picture, we know that Moses was a lawgiver. He brought what we commonly call the law of Moses. Of course, it was God's law given through Moses. But this passage is a hint and a suggestion that there would be another law that would follow the law of Moses, because this passage foretells of another lawgiver. Now, this is one among countless examples where these earlier themes in the patriarchal age touch on things very briefly that are developed more fully in future prophecies. Many years future to this event, the prophet Jeremiah picked up the idea of a lawgiver and foretold of the coming of the one who would bring the new covenant. And some of the passages that we'll touch on, God willing, through the course of this study will deal with the fact that there's one who would come, who would bring a new covenant, or who would be a lawgiver. And of course, that one is the Messiah. Well, is this a prophecy about the Messiah? And who is this individual here that's designated as Shiloh? What does the name or the word Shiloh mean? Well, that's a subject of a lot of debate and discussion and question and controversy. And if you're following along in the notes, you can turn to page 31. That's where we're commencing our study tonight. And you might look down through there and see that one of the meanings that is suggested for this, and the most commonly suggested meaning of the word Shiloh, is he whose it is, or its rightful owner, if we want to paraphrase that. So the passage would then be saying that the scepter would not depart from Judah until its rightful owner come along, the rightful owner of the scepter. Now, what does this suggest? Well, this suggests that there's somebody that was the source of the kingly authority that would be assigned to the tribe of Judah, and that person already existed when Israel spoke this prophecy to his sons. Does that suggest a pre-existent Messiah? Does that imply his deity? That's another theme that's going to come up as we study future prophecies. But the rightful owner of the scepter was already here in the theme of this prophecy. What else does it suggest? It suggests that all the other kings of the tribe of Judah were not the originators of that authority. They weren't the real rightful owners of that kingly power. The rightful owner was who? Someone says, God? Well, you're close. The rightful owner is Shiloh, Messiah. He whose it is. Consider the passage in Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 27, where the prophet Ezekiel is discussing the fall of the Judean monarchy there as the Babylonians had come in and attacked Judah and Jerusalem. And this is God's promise to stamp out that monarchy momentarily. He said, I will overturn it, and it shall be no more until he come whose right it is, and I will give it to him. Now, after the Babylonian captivity, were there any more kings that reigned from Jerusalem, from that seat of power over the kingdom of Israel or Judah? Well, no, not really. They had governors, and there were times that other foreign kings ruled them. But here he said, I'm going to overturn the Judean monarchy, and it's going to stay overturned until the rightful owner of that scepter comes along. And I don't mean to suggest that he whose right it is the same word that's translated Shiloh up there. I'm not trying to imply that. What I'm trying to suggest is that it means the same thing. Israel told his sons that there was going to come this person who is the originator of this kingly authority, the rightful owner of the kingly scepter, and that he would someday be given the kingdom. And once it got in his hands, it would stay that way. And until that time, the kingly tribe would be the tribe of Judah. Then Ezekiel the prophet, picking up this same idea, centuries later, come along and said, well, you know, God is frustrated with the Judean monarchy. They had led Judah off into idolatry, so he's going to overturn it. And he's going to leave it undone until the rightful owner of the kingly scepter comes. And then he's going to give it to him till Shiloh come. Now someone might say, well, but that's a lot of stretching and interpreting and comparing passages and so forth like that. Well, is it really? The Targum on Kalos, which is the Jewish Aramaic interpretation of or translation of the Old Testament, translates that passage until Messiah comes. Now, there are different Targums, and all these Targums, all they are is where they took the Hebrew and they translated it into Aramaic, and they did that with all the Old Testament. The Jews did that. And that exists all the way back to the time of Christ and prior to that. There are older copies of this. And that's how the Targums translate that the scepter would not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Messiah comes. So how did the Jews generally understand this passage in the first century? They understood it to be a prophecy of Messiah, just as we're explaining it this evening. This is a prophecy of Messiah's kingly authority. Now consider this. Christ is to be king. Messiah is to be king. Consider what is foretold of him in Luke chapter 1, verse 31 through 33. He said, behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb and bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus. And he shall be great, and he shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there shall be no end. Now here we find the prophecy that when Jesus was born, that he would eventually occupy the throne of his fleshly ancestor David. Jesus is to be born in the family of David. David was of the tribe of Judah. He's one of these people who would be a king in the tribe of Judah that Genesis 49 is hinting at when he talks about Judah being the kingly tribe. And this passage says that Jesus the Messiah would come and be a king on the throne of his ancestor David. And it says that he would reign over the house of Jacob forever. That his rule over Israel, over the Israel of God, would be perpetual. Isn't that just what Genesis 49 foretold? That all these different people in the tribe of Judah would be kings until Shiloh came, and then he would get the scepter and he would keep it. He would reign forever, and of his kingdom there would be no end. You know, the Jews in the first century commonly understood that of the Messiah. Look in John 12 and verse 34, for example. That's not in your notes, so if you're taking extra notes, you might want to jot that down. John 12 and 34, as Jesus explained the fact that he would be lifted up or crucified. Some of them couldn't understand that because they said Messiah is supposed to abide forever. Where'd they get that idea? They got that idea from passages like Genesis 49 and many, many others that foretold the perpetuity or the eternal nature of his reign, that he would be a king forever. So the idea that we find in Luke chapter 1 as Jesus' birth is explained to Mary, his mother, that idea is seated back in Genesis 49. So back in the patriarchal age, we have a trickling stream, you see, beginning. And that stream is being fed throughout the times of the patriarchs. And these same ideas were in that trickling stream early on are taken up by prophets later on and expanded upon. So what Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah and all the others were talking about when they talked about the coming of the Messiah was really nothing new. It's something that had been preached since the Garden of Eden, with more and more details being added as time passed by. Now, to him shall the gathering of the people be. The word that's translated gathering there actually means obedience. The people would be drawn to him in obedience. John 12:32, Jesus said, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me." Now, you can read the verses around that, and you'll see that Jesus is talking about the manner of death that he would die. When he would be lifted up, that is, when he would be crucified, he would by that means draw people to him, to submit to him, to be obedient to him. To him would the gathering or the obedience of the people be. So you see, that's the second half of the prophecy there, that Shiloh would come, the Messiah would come, he would be a king, ruling on David's throne, ruling over the Israel of God, and not only would be a king, but by means of his sacrifice, he would draw people to be obedient to him. Now let's move along to the star prophecy, and I got to confess to you that this is one that had for years escaped my attention. I knew about Genesis 49, but this next one escaped my attention until I was preparing this series. Did you know that Balaam, bad boy Balaam in the Old Testament, Balaam prophesied of the Messiah? I didn't know that. I'm sure a lot of you did, because a lot of you are smarter than me. Well, let's read about it in Numbers 24. Now, I know Balaam said some bad things and did some bad things, but he got something right here in Numbers 24, beginning at verse 17. He said, "I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and shall destroy the children of Sheth," or the tumultuous children is the way some translate that. "And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies. And Israel shall do valiantly. And out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion. And he shall destroy him that remaineth of the city." Now here, Balaam foretells the coming of the star out of Jacob, or out of the nation of Israel. And he refers to this one as having a scepter rising up out of Israel. That's the same as that kingly scepter that we read about in Genesis chapter 49 many years earlier. So here Balaam the prophet, remember last night's study, as many as prophesied foretold of these days. Here Balaam the prophet picks up the Messianic theme and says, yes, this star, the rightful owner of the kingly scepter, is going to rise up out of Israel. Now what's he going to do? Well, he's going to defeat the Moabites and the Edomites. Oh boy, says an Israelite. When Messiah comes, he's going to defeat all of our enemies, and we'll be the supreme nation. Let's go back to Genesis 3 for just a moment. I want to ask you a question. Right there in the throes of what was brought upon mankind in Genesis chapter 3, when sin, death, and separation from God was brought onto Adam and Eve there. As Adam and Eve were being sent out of the garden, what consolation would it be to them that one day Israel would securely possess a parcel of land in the Middle East? How's that going to help them? That's not what Messiah come to do. I'm not saying there's not a land promise. We're going to study that land promise as we proceed through. We've already touched on it briefly in the promise to Abraham, but we'll expand on it more, Lord willing, as we proceed. But putting your arm around Adam and Eve, broken-spirited, being sent out of the Garden of Eden, saying, hey, take comfort. Never mind that you're separated from God, that you've got this sin debt hanging on you, that you and everybody else someday is going to die. Don't worry about it. Someday Israel will be secure in their homeland. Won't it be nice? Not going to help them. Messiah's work is bigger and better than that. Messiah's work is spiritual in its focus. And when he talked about the coming of this star of Jacob and the scepter rising out of Israel and him having dominion and defeating the enemies of God, here we find enemies such as Moab and Edom representing the real enemy, which is Satan. Because why? Because last night we learned that Genesis 3 and 15 foretells an ongoing war between good and evil. And when the children of Satan do battle against the children of God, that represents the work of Satan himself. And the work of Satan himself is bringing sin, death and separation from God upon mankind. And when Messiah come to defeat the work of Satan, that's what he come to do. And all these other pieces of the battle between good and evil, like the Moabites and the Edomites against the Israelites, all that is just a shadowy likeness of the real war that's going on. The battle that Christ is fighting and has fought to save you and I from our greatest enemy, Satan. Not seer, not chef, but Satan. And this Messiah will have dominion, again foretelling his kingly throne. The Jewish Targums, that is these Aramaic translations, they apply this passage to the Messiah. They recognize this as a prophecy of the Messiah. Now, someone says, well, but no, that's about David. He's the star coming out of Jacob. All right, David subjugated Moab and Edom. You'll see that in 2 Samuel 8. But he never fully destroyed them in the sense that this passage foretells. Because in the prophet Jeremiah, 250 years after David lived and died, Jeremiah was foretelling the fall of Moab and Edom and talking about the great power that they enjoyed in Jeremiah's day, but the fact that that power would be brought to ruin. So this must look beyond King David to the Messiah. You see, a lot of times the Jewish mindset on these passages has a problem because they try to understand this as physical battle and physical warfare. And that's a misunderstanding of Messiah's mission. And I want to tell you quite honestly, today, many Christians and so-called Christians who hold the premillennial view have the same problem. I'm talking about these people that are anticipating Christ coming back to the earth someday to fight this great battle of Armageddon, in which occasion he's going to vanquish all these enemies of Israel and set up Israel in their promised land and all like that. That premillennial idea has the same fundamental misunderstanding of Messiah's mission. Is this foretelling that Messiah would someday come to the earth, meaning at the end of time, and vanquish the Moabites and the Edomites? It can't be, and I want to show you why. Moab and Edom no longer exist. They're gone. The Edomites were absorbed into the nation of Israel in the time of the Maccabees and the years that followed. By the time Christ came along on the earth, in the first century, the Edomites basically didn't exist as a nation. The Moabites no longer exist as a nation either. How's Christ going to come at the end of time or at his second coming and vanquish them when they've already been vanquished? You see, this isn't about some physical war. It's about Messiah's spiritual battle to save us from our sins. It's about that divine help. Jesus is this bright and morning star. Revelation 22 and verse 16, I have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright and morning star. Jesus tells John in the Revelation in the present tense, he is of the offspring of David. He is in the family of David. And he is on that occasion the bright and morning star that Balaam foretold in Numbers chapter 24. Now, when you go back to the context of Numbers 24 and look at verse 14, you'll find Balaam is foretelling things that would happen in the latter days. Someone says, that's got to be the end of time. No, that's got to be the first century, and I'm going to tell you why. The Apostle Peter, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, stood up in Acts chapter 2 and verse 17 and said, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. It shall come to pass when? In the last days. The Hebrew writer opened his book, saying, God hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. The latter days was the latter days of the Mosaic dispensation. And that was in the first century. The latter days of the Jewish economy, as some put it. That has already come and gone. And Messiah has come and done this mission of becoming king. And that's something else we'll see as we proceed through our study. Now, what about the coming of the great prophet? I'm talking about another study, or prophecy rather, that was made right at the end or the edge of the patriarchal age. The patriarchal age ended with the giving of Moses' law. And this is found in the earlier stages of Moses' law. Deuteronomy 18, as God talked to Moses, and Moses talked to Israel about Moses' work and a future prophet, he said, the Lord thy God will raise unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him shall you hearken. And then in verse 18, I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee. and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. So here God told Moses, I'm going to send another prophet that will be like you. And Moses told Israel, God is going to send another prophet that will be like me. And I want to tell you that the Jews have, in earlier times, universally understood this as being Messianic, or generally at least understood it as being Messianic. Let me show you that in the first century. In John chapter 1, verse 21, look at the early ministry of Christ. They asked him, what then, art thou Elias? And he said, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, no. What prophet? These people had in mind a concept that a prophet was coming like unto Moses. And the reason they had that concept in their minds is because that's what Deuteronomy 18 told them. Reading on now in verse 25, they asked him and said, why baptizest thou then, if thou be not that Christ, nor Elias, neither that prophet? Verse 45, Philip findeth Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So upon encountering Jesus, Philip drew the conclusion, he's the one. He's the one that Moses wrote about in the law. Let's keep reading. In John chapter 4, the famous story of the woman at the well, in verse 19, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. She said that upon the realization that Jesus knew her lifestyle. What was it that he said? You've had 5 husbands, and the one that you're with now is not your husband, something like that. That's what called upon her to say, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Many suggest that she's not just saying any prophet, that she's saying, I perceive you are the prophet. Now, whether or not she thought that in verse 19, I'll tell you, she reached that conclusion in verse 29 because she went and told others, come and see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ? Now, why would this woman at the well make a connection between a man being a prophet of God and a man being the Messiah? Because there's a lot of prophets of God throughout the history of Israel that were not the Messiah. Well, but there's supposed to be one special prophet come, Moses said, that would be unique from all other prophets, in that he would be like Moses. And when this woman encountered Jesus, she perceived that there was something special about him that was more similar to Moses than any other prophet of Israel about which she had read in the Old Testament Scriptures. And from that she concluded that Jesus was the Messiah that they understood was being foretold in Deuteronomy chapter 18. In John chapter 6 and verse 14, then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. There's no other passage that they could be referring to when they talked about that prophet other than Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15 and verse 18, and of course the surrounding verses. Now, what caused these people to conclude that Jesus was that prophet when they saw him doing miracles? Now, why would they think that doing miracles is what set Jesus apart from all the other prophets of Israel that meant he was the Messiah? Well, there's something in this promise of Deuteronomy 18 evidently that led them to conclude that. Before we go deeper into that, look at John 7 and verse 40. Many of the people, therefore, when they heard this saying, said, of a truth, this is the prophet. Over and over we find evidence in the New Testament that first century Israel was looking for a Messiah to come who fit the description in Deuteronomy 18, verse 15 and verse 18. Now, what was unique about Moses above other prophets? You might say, what do you mean about that? Well, here's what I mean. God told Moses, I'm going to send another prophet that will be like you. And everybody's going to listen to him. All right, are we talking about Obadiah? Are we talking about Isaiah? Isaiah was a great prophet. Why didn't he, when people come along, why didn't people look at him and say, hey, you're that guy in Deuteronomy 18. Why? Was he not like Moses? Evidently not. What about Ezekiel? He was a great prophet. What about Jeremiah? What about Elijah or Elisha? Those guys worked miracles. Why didn't the people look at them and say, hey, wait, You're that prophet that was foretold in Deuteronomy chapter 18. The point I'm getting at is as you talk about all these different prophets throughout the history of Israel, none of them were like unto Moses. They were all great men, great prophets. Their work and their words was so important, but they weren't like Moses. Moses was unique. In what way? Deuteronomy 33 and verse 4 says, Moses commanded us a law, even the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. Go back to page 31 of the notes, the opening section there. What did he say Shiloh would be, the Messiah? He said he would be a lawgiver. Now, what did we observe from Genesis 49 and verse 10? We observed that when he foretold the coming of the Messiah, that he portrayed Messiah as one who would bring a law. And since Moses wasn't the one, since he wasn't Shiloh, he wasn't the king, he didn't have the scepter, you see, Moses' law isn't the law that was being foretold in Genesis 49. It has to be the law of the Messiah. But Moses did bring a law. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 4, Moses commanded us a law. What other prophet brought a new law? Not until we get to Jesus Christ the Messiah do we find another prophet of God who brought a law. And he brought the new covenant will of Christ. In Deuteronomy 34, verse 10 through 12, he said, this was speaking in retrospect of Moses' life, said, there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses. Now we're getting to something that'll help us. Whom the Lord knew face to face in all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his servants, to all his land, and in all that mighty hand and all the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel. This inspired eulogy about Moses' life said all these other prophets in Israel that I was talking to you about a moment ago, none of them were like Moses. In what way were they not like Moses? Well, Moses knew the Lord face to face. He had direct access to God. And in that role, he mediated between God and Israel. Not only that, Moses was a lawgiver, like Shiloh or Messiah was foretold to be, a lawgiver. Not only that, but Moses did more miracles than any of the other prophets. I know some of the prophets we can read about them doing miracles, but none of them did the volume of mighty works like what Moses did. In Numbers chapter 12, verse 6 through 8, God talking about how he would communicate with Moses in contrast with how he would communicate with other prophets. It says, he said, hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. And I will speak to him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Here God, in talking about Moses and his prophetic work, made a contrast between Moses and all the other prophets of Israel. And in developing this contrast, he said, I'll show you an area where Moses is different than Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all these other guys. Moses had direct access to God. God spoke to him face to face, and Moses beheld the similitude of the Lord. Those other guys didn't have that. All they had was the vision and the dream. You might be thinking Isaiah 6. Isaiah 6 was a vision. Those of you who are familiar with that passage know that's where Isaiah saw God's throne room. It was a vision. Moses saw it because he was there with God on Mount Sinai. He had direct access to God. So, that's one thing the Bible says stands Moses apart from all the other prophets of Israel. Another thing we read on the previous screen there from Deuteronomy 34, another thing that sets Moses apart is the mighty miracles that he did. And then another thing that sets him apart, we read, he's a lawgiver. He actually delivered a law. Isaiah and the other guys, they just commented on the law that already existed. They didn't bring anything new. And so when we look for Messiah, we're looking for someone who would not just be an ordinary prophet of God, but someone who would have direct access to God in his mediatorial work, in being a mediator between God and man, someone who would perform mighty miracles, and someone who would be a lawgiver. Look at the direct access to God issue. Some of you might have recognized a familiar phrase in Numbers chapter 12, verse 6 through 8, which we just read, about him being faithful in all his house. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 2 through 6 quotes that passage in making a comparison between Moses and Christ. You know why? Because Jesus was that other prophet who was like unto Moses, faithful in all his house. And Christ has direct access to God to even a greater degree than Moses. For 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5 says, there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. Christ has greater access to God even than Moses, because Christ isn't just man, He's also God. He's also divine. We saw that in Noah's prophecy last night. You can go back to page 4 of your notes, and there you'll find the charted breakdown of Noah's song there, where he talks about God dwelling in the tents of Shem, and how that's a foretelling of the incarnation of the Son of God, deity manifest in the flesh. And as such, Christ is both man and God, and as such, He truly reaches one hand out to God in the heavens and one hand down to earth to mankind. He is a true mediator between God and man. Moses only typified that in a shadowy way. What about the issue of doing mighty miracles? How would a Jewish individual interpret all this? Well, how did they interpret it in the first century? In Luke chapter 7, let's see, verse 20 through 22, it says, when the men were coming to him, they said, John Baptist hath sent us unto thee, saying, art thou he that should come? Or look we for another? And in that same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues and of evil spirits. And unto many that were blind he gave sight. And Jesus answered and said to them, go your way and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, and how that the blind see, the lame walk, and lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor the gospel is preached. When John sent from prison his disciples to Jesus, say, are you the Messiah? Are you that prophet that's like unto Moses? Are you the one that they've been foretelling since Genesis 3:15? Or are we looking for another? As evidence to his identity, Jesus said, you go back and tell John how many miracles I've done. And from that, John was supposed to conclude what? That he is the Christ. He was supposed to conclude what they concluded in John 7:31, when many of the people believed on him and said, when Christ cometh, will he do more miracles than these which this man hath done? Why would the Jews have the anticipation that when the Messiah would come, he would do an inordinate amount of miracles? Because that's what the prophets had foretold. And I know we're going to study later on, Lord willing, about Isaiah foretelling that, for example, in Isaiah chapter 35. And I know he foretold that there, and perhaps another place or two that we can find. But I'll tell you where that part of the story began to be told, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, when God said, I'm sending another prophet like Moses. And there's no other prophet in Israel like Moses, and all the miracles that he did, until you get to the next lawgiver, Shiloh, the Messiah. He was a worker of great miracles, even beyond those that Moses did. And it was so impressive and such a powerful display that as the people witnessed the ministry of Christ and all the miracles that he performed, and they contemplated the promise in Deuteronomy 18, they said, this has to be the Christ. How many more miracles do we need? You see, it's not just that he could do miracles, it's the fact that it was expected that the Messiah would not just work a few miracles, but an inordinate amount of miracles. So much so that when you look through the stream of time at all the men of God, you would overlook Obadiah, you'd overlook Malachi, you'd overlook Zechariah, you'd overlook Isaiah, you'd overlook Daniel and Ezekiel, you'd overlook Elijah and Elisha, you'd see Moses as a great miracle worker, and then you'd see Messiah as an even a greater miracle worker. That's what Deuteronomy 18 teaches us to expect in the Messiah. What about being a lawgiver? Well, Jesus is certainly a lawgiver in Hebrews 9, verse 15 through 17. For this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, and that by means of death, for the redemption of transgressions that were under the First Testament, that they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of a testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. So here we find Christ bringing in a new law, a New Testament, Not just any old way, but by means of death. You remember when that death first began to be foretold? In Genesis 3:15 that we studied last night. And we see the further expansion on that throughout the stream of time. And here the Hebrew writer picks up that idea and ties it to the fact that Jesus is the lawgiver. The book of James, I believe it's chapter 4 and 17, says there's one lawgiver. That's Christ. That's Jesus. That's the Messiah. Not until, from Moses forward, not until we get to Jesus do we find someone bringing in a new system. So when someone looks at Genesis 49 and then looks at Moses, they're to conclude from Genesis 49 and the ministry of Moses, okay, Moses brought one law, there's supposed to be another one coming that the Messiah would bring. And the Jewish nation today says Jesus can't be the Messiah because he brought a new law. I want to tell you the Jewish scripture says that's what he had to do in order to be the Messiah, is to be the lawgiver that Genesis 49 said he would be. Moses compared to the prophet. Moses had direct access to God. Jesus, the Messiah, the prophet's a mediator for man with God. Moses worked great miracles. Jesus' identity was verified by great miracles. Moses delivered the first law. Jesus delivered that second covenant, as it's referred to in the book of Hebrews. Now, let's talk about other patriarchal prophecies of Christ. I think it probably been 2 or 3 years back that y'all had some studies on the book of Job. I don't remember exactly when, but I know when y'all talked about the book of Job, you might have talked about the fact that Job anticipating the coming of Christ. That shouldn't surprise us, because the book of James chapter 5 refers to Job as a prophet. And what did we learn last night? We learned that as many as foretold of the coming of the days of the Messiah, that every prophet since the world began that was a prophet of God has been talking about the coming of the Messiah. The only question we have is how much record do we have of what each prophet might have said regarding the Messiah. No doubt some of what they preach we don't have written record of, but we certainly do have a lot of written record, don't we? And we've got written record of things that Job said in his book. Now, in the depths of his sorrow and from the pit of his grief, Job wrestled with guilt. Job wrestled with why. Job wrestled with what have I done. Job wrestled with, wait, I haven't done anything to deserve this. And he went from that extreme back down to talking about how worthless and sinful man is. He was all over the page emotionally. And we shouldn't be surprised that a man going through such awful trials would experience such emotions. Why? Because Job was locked in a battle that's part of the ongoing war between good and evil. Job was a child of God, and as such, that made him an enemy of Satan. Vile and malevolent was Satan in his attacks that he wrought against Job, trying in earnest to draw Job away from God. And Job would never yield, would he? You see, Job's whole story is a retelling of that war that was foretold in Genesis 3:15. And evidently in Job's heart, he understood the real solution to his problem. It wasn't about restoring his possessions. It wasn't about bringing back his kids or getting a new set of kids or restoring his dignity in the community or getting his family to love him again or getting his friends to hush. It was about getting his sins taken care of. It was about having a mediator, someone to plead his case before God. See Messiah foretold in the book of Job, chapter 16 and verse 21. Oh, that one might plead for a man with God as a man pleadeth for his neighbor. From this pit of sorrows, Job cried out, begging that there would be somebody who would enter God's heavenly court and speak to God on his behalf. In Romans 8 and verse 34, who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us, who is doing exactly what Job begged for. Someone to go before God and argue our case. He is the mediator, as foretold by Job. Job chapter 9, verse 32 and 33 from the New King James says, He is not a man as I am, talking about God, that I may answer him, and that we should go to court together, nor is there any mediator between us who may lay his hand on us both. In his sorrow and his frustration and his desire to appeal to God about why am I suffering, why is this curse upon me, Job, talking about God, said, God is not a man like me. I can't just sashay into his court and make demands. I can't go before him and make a demand that he do this or do that. And then he cried that there's no mediator between God and man. Listen to this language, who can lay his hand on us both. Now think about Jesus in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5, which we studied a moment ago, who like Moses is the mediator between man and God, but different from Moses is so because he is both God and man. Philippians 2, verse 6 and 7, of Jesus it said, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Just like Genesis 3:15 foretold, her seed, divine aid, coming in human form. Now I said last night, Genesis 3:15 implies we're having divine aid coming in human form. Now we're getting down to the part of the equation that says it's not just divine aid that's coming in human form, it's deity coming in the flesh, made in the likeness of men. Job gets his mediator, the one who can put his hand on both God and man, for he was both. Job foresaw the need of a redeemer and foresaw the coming of his Redeemer. In Job 19, verse 25 through 27, he said, for I know that my Redeemer lives, that he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold him, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Job thirsted to see that day for which we all yearn. The day when our Redeemer will come and we can look on him with our own eyes. Even after his body is destroyed, Job said, even after his skin is destroyed, even after worms eat his flesh, he says, this I know, that in my flesh I'll see God. How can that be? Because his flesh would be raised. The psalmist David picked up that same idea in Psalm 17 and 15. As for me, I will behold thy face. In my flesh I shall see God, Job said. David said, I will behold thy face. In righteousness I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness. You see, David knew that his vile worm-eaten flesh would be brought out of that grave too, just like Job's. And with his eyes he would see his Redeemer. And Jesus is the realization of that in 1 John 3 and verse 2. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we'll see him as he is. Here he foresees that in the resurrection, we will be raised in the likeness of Christ, and with our eyes, we will look at him, and in our flesh, we will see him. We will behold his face, and we'll be satisfied. I want to tell you right now, that's when the war will be over. And we will have part in the victory that can only be had in Jesus Christ. There are also patriarchal types of Christ. By that I mean there are characters from the patriarchal age who very, very closely resemble the Messiah. And I'll try to show you what I mean by that as we proceed. If you're looking for the information about Job, you'll find the slides about that on page 50 of your notes. And you can leaf a page or two further in your notes, and you'll find these charts. And I want to invite you to look at these charts carefully and take those scriptures home with you when you get the opportunity to do so, and read them and study them. Because I think what we're going to see here should be amazing to us all. Hebrews 10 and verse 1 says, the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually, make the comers thereunto perfect. This passage talks about how there's a lot of things in the law that foreshadow things in the new covenant age. And it introduces for us the idea or the principle of shadows or types, where there are some things that are not exactly like the real thing, they're just a shadow of the real thing. Hebrews 9:24 put it like this: Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. What I believe we will find is that there are many characters in the patriarchal age that are a lot like these pieces of the law. That they're not really Christ himself, they're figures of Christ. They're not really the Messiah, but they shadow or they typify the Messiah. Let me show you that with Job. Job did not deserve his suffering. God said that in Job 2 and verse 3. Job was rejected by his own family and friends. He protested that in Job 19. Job was falsely accused of sinning to bring this tragedy into his life, and that accusation was false. Job was mocked by people of the community. He talked about that on a couple occasions. We have those passages cited on the chart. Job was spat upon in derision for what he was going through. But at the end of the day, Job was glorified before others, and in that glorified state, he served as a priest for his brethren. Now go down that right column, and you'll see every one of those things is true of Christ. Christ did not deserve the suffering because 1 Peter 2 and 22 foretells us that he was innocent. He had no sin, neither was gall found in his mouth. That's foretold in the Old Testament. Christ was rejected by his own. His disciples forsook him and fled. That was foretold. Christ was falsely accused in Matthew 26. That was foretold. Christ was mocked in Luke 22 and verse 63. That was foretold. Jesus was spat upon in Matthew 26 and in Matthew 27. That was foretold in the prophets. And Jesus served as a priest for his brethren. In Hebrews 2 and 17, he took upon himself the nature of flesh that he might be a compassionate high priest for you and I. In his glorified state, just like Job, he served as a priest for his brethren. And every one of these ways, Job typifies or foreshadows Christ. Not only that, but every one of these elements is foretold elsewhere in prophetic Scripture. That's just a whole lot amazing to me, because Job isn't the only patriarchal figure of which this is true. Isaac had a miraculous birth, remember? His folks were old, and so God stepped in and promised Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have a child in spite of the fact that Abraham was what, over 100 and Sarah was 90? God made it happen by miraculous means. Isaac was referred to as Abraham's only son in Genesis 22 and verse 2, even though we know Ishmael was also his offspring, and he had other family later on in life, but insofar as the promise was concerned, Isaac was his only son. Isaac was the child of the promise. Isaac carried the wood for his sacrificing up the hill on his back. Isaac was sacrificed on a mountain, not for crimes that he had done, and Isaac did not protest. And you go down that right column and you'll find every one of those things said of Christ. He was born of a virgin. That's a miraculous birth. He's referred to as God's only son. He's the child of the promise, of the Abrahamic promise that we touched on last night. He carried the cross, the wood, for his sacrificing up that hill and was sacrificed on the Mount Calvary. He was not sacrificed for crimes that he had done, but for crimes that we have done. And as a lamb, he was silent before his accusers and before his tormentors. And every one of those things is foretold about Jesus in other prophecies. Look at Joseph, the son of Jacob there in the book of Genesis. Joseph was hated by his brethren without a cause. So was Jesus. Joseph was mocked by his brethren. So was Jesus. Joseph was plotted against by his brethren. In John 11, the plot against Jesus commenced. Joseph was rejected by his own people. John 1 and 11 says Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not. Joseph was stripped of his robe, and so was Jesus. Joseph was sold for silver, and in Matthew 26, so was Jesus. Joseph was falsely accused, and so was Jesus. Joseph was placed with two guilty men there in prison, the butler and the baker, in Genesis chapter 40. And Jesus was placed between two guilty men when he was crucified, between two thieves. Joseph was given authority after his deliverance from prison. He was exalted, and so was Jesus when he said, all power is given to me in heaven and earth, after he escaped the prison of death. Joseph suffered in order to save others. When he was speaking forgiveness to his brethren, he said, don't you see that God sent me ahead of you folks? He did this to save much people alive. That's when it hit me. Joseph is a type of Christ. And of course, Christ suffered on our behalf. Joseph forgave his tormentors, and so did Jesus, when from the cross he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So far as I can tell, almost every one of these, there may be an exception or two, but almost every one of these is also foretold in specific prophecy about Christ in other places in the Old Testament. That's too much to just be a coincidence. Moses is a type of Christ. When Moses was born, it was at a time when male children were being killed. in order to try to subdue the Hebrew race. That was Satan waging war against God's people. And he did the same thing in Matthew 2 when the little children of Bethlehem were killed at the time of Christ's birth. Moses delivered people from bondage, so did Jesus. Delivers us from the bondage of sin. Moses was a lawgiver, and as we studied, so is Jesus. Moses built the tabernacle of God, and Jesus said, on this rock I will build my church, the spiritual tabernacle of God today. Moses was a miracle worker, and as we studied tonight, so was Jesus. Moses left the throne for the people. When he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, he left his throne on behalf of his people, and so did Jesus when he left the throne of heaven and was made in the likeness of flesh. The people rejected Moses' rule, and they did with Jesus as well. In fact, in Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, he kind of drew a comparison there. In verse 35, he told them how the people of Israel rejected Moses. In verse 52, he said, you're doing the same thing to Jesus. Moses was almost stoned in Exodus 17. You might remember that. Jesus was almost stoned in John chapter 8 in verse 59. Moses was a mediator for the people of God. He spoke to God on their behalf and spoke to them on God's behalf. And Jesus has the same office for you and I today. Almost, not every one so far as I can tell, but almost every one of these things is foretold in other prophecies as well. Similar to Moses, we find that the Exodus is a likeness of Jesus. Exodus was a case of slavery. We're enslavement to sin. Exodus involved the attempt at killing the sons that we talked about earlier, and there was the attempt to kill baby Jesus. Exodus had Moses as deliverer. Jesus is our deliverer. With the Exodus, there's the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. And the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 5 that Christ is our Passover. With Exodus, they crossed the Red Sea. 1 Corinthians 10 says that compares to baptism. At the end of the Exodus, there was the covenant at Sinai. And with the end of the ministry of Christ, there's the new covenant will of Jesus Christ. All these foretellings of Jesus in these characters of the Old Testament, and I'm content we're only scratching the surface and the parallels that can be drawn. Last night in our study, we talked about Genesis 3, foretelling Messiah's suffering and resurrection. And we also talked about how Noah, in his song there about the curse against Canaan and Ham, how that he foretold the divine incarnation. We talked about the universal nature of the Messianic work in Genesis chapter 12 when God gave that original seed promise to Abraham. That was just an extension of the earlier seed promise in Genesis 3 in verse 15. Tonight in our study, we've seen the foretelling of Messiah's kingdom, that he's the owner of the kingly scepter in Genesis 49 and in Numbers 24. And we've also seen it foretold that Messiah would be a miracle worker and a lawgiver in the foretelling of the coming prophet. Now, these are the 5 points in the core prophetic theme about the Messiah that commenced in the patriarchal age. In the age of the patriarchs, this 5-point core theme began to be told. A trickle commenced in Genesis chapter 3 in verse 15. As time rocked on, Noah added to that stream with his words inspired by the Holy Spirit. Many, many years passed before people like Israel added a little more detail. And then along comes Balaam. And then along comes another prophet and another prophet, adding bit by bit. We find Moses adding just a little more detail to the picture until the 5-point theme comes into view. Lord willing, in tomorrow evening's study, we're going to talk about the prophetic method, or how we can go about interpreting these prophecies in a way that's consistent with teachings of Scripture. And then after that, we'll look at the monarchical prophecies that began to be foretold in Samuel's day and in David's day in places like 2 Samuel and in books like the Psalms. And these are going to be nothing more or less than expansions on earlier themes, but with more detail being added. The stream is widening until the times of the major prophets and the minor prophets, and even more details are added, and that stream is swelling and swelling into a great flood of messianic expectation until the prophetic picture was in place in the first century. And Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was born of a virgin, divine help, sent to save you from Satan and the sin and the death and the separation from God that he brought. Why on earth would you sit still when God has done so much to save you and foretold through so many people that he would save you? Why would you sit still through that and not accept the salvation that he offers by giving your allegiance to his Son? Jesus was lifted up that we might be gathered to him in obedience. Will you be gathered to him in obedience tonight? Will you submit your life to the will of Christ tonight and becoming a Christian. If you've not done so, you need to do so now. Or if you're a Christian, you need to live this testimony that we studied about in Revelation chapter 12. You need to live faithful and true to Him. And if you need the prayers of the church to assist you in that, we'd love to help you in either way if you'll please come as we stand and sing the invitation song.